Shalom and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So just a few housekeeping things for me. I have a cough, so please forgive me if I have to excuse myself every so often and drink. It's been a lingering effect of when I was sick several weeks ago. So anyway, welcome. I am so glad that everyone is here. I'm blocking my own view, so I may not see everybody in the room or all of the questions or comments. So make sure that if I don't address a question or comment, that you bring it back up. You're welcome also to raise your hand and go on the mic. I'm going to pause quite frequently because this is a pretty wordy class, this one, and for questions and comments or those at various times. But if there's something that comes up, please just type that. You can type that into the chat as well. So here we go. Okay, I'm gonna close this down. And so just a little bit of a review to begin. Sorry, my iPad is glitching here. If there weren't technical issues, it wouldn't be a thing, right? So to begin, in the last class here, so all of the footage we didn't make it ourselves. So just let you know. So in the last class, we discussed the idea that the world in which we live in is a world where God's presence is concealed, and we did explore this concept mainly in the construct of Moses talking to God. He requests that, Moses asks for Hashem, for God to reveal his ways to him. And in Exodus 33:13, I think I have the next slide here. Again, it's glitching, so let's see. And it's not advancing. There we go. So in Exodus 33:13, Moses asks of God, he says, and now if I have indeed found favor in your eyes, pray, let me know your ways, so that I may know you, and that I may find favor in your eyes. And God answers Moses with the following in Exodus 33:18-20. He says, and he said, God said, show me your glory. And Moses says to God, show me your glory. And the reply is, God says, I will let all my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will favor when I wish to favor, and I will have compassion when I wish to have compassion. And he said, you will not be able to see my face, for man shall not see me and live. So this is a really important idea that we had discussed in the last, again, this keeps glitching on me here, that we had discussed that God cannot possibly reveal all of his ways to us. It's impossible. We're finite. We're limited in our ability to comprehend the infinite. And in fact, there's really no way that God could have fulfilled Moses's request without ultimately causing the nullification of Moses himself. So this encounter really highlights that our reality is limited by the fact that we're only able to grasp the effect of God's actions. We can't understand and comprehend the inner aspects of creation, nor the means or processes that God uses to bring them about, because they really touch upon things about God that we can't fathom in a reality we can't comprehend. So Moses' encounter really reveals an important question, and that is, how exactly does this infinite interface with the finite? And how does physical interact with the spiritual and vice versa? So it's apparent that while we ask these questions, that these seemingly irreconcilable concepts obviously have a resolution. In spite of God having an infinite existence, we're aware that he exists. We're talking about him right now. And he's revealed himself to mankind in various ways and numerous times. Also, we're created beings. We can feel our own existence apart from God. We perceive ourselves as something, as a yesh, as an otherness that exists. We see ourselves as a something. So this means that God obviously also has the capacity to constrain his existence and not completely nullify and overwhelm our finite being. And as we see in the case with Moses, that encounter with God It's God's desire to reveal himself to Moses. He says, I want to have all my goodness pass before you. Yet when God wishes to reveal himself in that to mankind, he has to conceal himself first. So the mechanism by which this is possible is addressed in the very first words of the Torah. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Need to see if we are at, go back. So going back, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So Rashi and Ibn Ezra, and if you have the stone Chumash, you're going to see a little bit of different translation. They actually say that the verse should read in the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, as they don't view this first chapter of Genesis as being chronological order of creation. But the Ramban and many other commentators, the verse indeed is viewed as chronological. And so they say that this is the very first action. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this understanding is quite profound. There means that there's a quantum leap from infinite to finite. Creation, including our very existence, comes yesh me'ayin, means something from nothing, from absolute nothingness. So in Kabbalah, God is referred to as a concept called the Ein Sof, meaning the being that has no end, Ein Sof, no end. So this is a conceptualization of a state of existence that is completely incomprehensible. We know it must exist, intellectually, but that really is the extent of our knowledge. There's a Kabbalist, his name's Rabbi Meir Ben Gabai, states in Avodat HaKodesh that the Ein Sof is the most powerful being of all. He's personifying it a bit more than usual, but he has a purpose. Just as it possesses infinite powers, so does it possess finite powers. For if you were to say that God can only express himself in an infinite manner, then and not a finite manner, then you're diminishing his perfection. This means that our finite existence ultimately extends from the Ein Sof. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi taught that this is from the infinite existence of the Ein Sof that our physical objects first come into being. That this otherness, the sense of yesh, our material existence in this world, and including our own existence, ultimately are an expression of the true yesh, or meaning the otherness of God's existence. And a really important concept to remind yourself as we go through these ideas is that any concept, any attribute, any reality, anything that we ascribe to God is solely for our benefit. It does not in any way whatsoever define who God is or is not. So therefore, this includes concepts of God's infinite and finite existence. So an important idea, though, is that there is really no limitation in how God can ultimately bring about creation. But just knowing that God can do anything really doesn't do a whole lot. We know that our finite existence can extend from this infinite reality, but that still really doesn't answer that big question, is how did God make something very finite, which is our physicality, our reality, out of his infinite existence? And how does this even come about? So we talked about the Rambam and the Rambam and the 13, these 13 principles of faith. So we have, one of them is God is an absolute unity. He's a one in every possible respect. So if this is true, how can creation exist at all? And if God is an absolute unity and there's no element of form, there's no structure, there's no plurality in him whatsoever, how can we even know God at all? And to quote Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who's one of my favorite rabbis from Inner Space, we thus have this paradoxical situation where the very existence of anything but God himself becomes extremely tenuous. God's simple essence is so powerful that it must be hidden if creation is to exist at all. If, on the other hand, God were to withdraw himself completely, any creation would cease to exist. Excuse me, one moment. Any questions so far? Okay. Thank you. So one of the examples of this idea is that here we go. This is difficult because well, that's a separate question we'll be talking about next week. ABC, I mean, the next class, not next week. We're going to be expounding on some of these ideas in a future date, God willing. So I've kind of lost track of my slides here. Okay, we're on the right one. Bear with me here, full screen. Okay, so slide 6. And then I think after this one, I will be taking a short break for some drinks. So this concept, so we have this paradox here. If we're to, there's no plurality, there's no differentiation, and God is as essence and infinite absolute unity, how do we know that he exists at all? So this concept is explained by the Arizal, who we talked about as a Kabbalist. And his disciple, Chaim Vital, wrote in a book called The Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life. He discusses this one simple, undifferentiated essence of God filled all of creation. There was no emptiness, no void, no category of beginning or end. And this is the Ein Sof. This is the Ein Sof. This power and the ability of the Ein Sof extends into something called the Or Ein Sof, or the light of the Ein Sof. And this is an analogy that's used because physical light is perceived as being ethereal and intangible, and it's light in our world that gives us warmth. It sustains our world, and therefore it's used in Kabbalah as a metaphor for divine power. Again, the essence of the Or Ein Sof is in no way subject to any space or physicality. This is expressly stated in the Tanya. It's purely a concept to help us understand this process of creation. So it's not a physical light. It doesn't have physicality, but that's the analogy that we use to understand it more. So the Arizal says, when it arose in his simple will, meaning God's simple will, his Ratzon, to create all of the universes, he constricted his infinite light. After this constriction occurred, there was a place where all things could be brought into existence, created, formed, and completed. This contraction, called the Tzimtzum HaRishon, that first contraction, is not to be taken literally though, since it is stated before, impossible to apply any spatial concept to God. Rather, this is speaking in a conceptual sense. This is a concealment of the light of God, or the Or Ein Sof, and this is the most radical thing to happen in all of creation ever. Everything else is just an echo of this original contraction. And that it is a quantum leap forward to bring finitude to surface, meaning that our ultimate creation extends from this. But this is the most radical change that the world creation will undergo. As I stated before, everything else is but an echo of this original action. So this does create a paradox though. It's impossible for God's presence to be absent from anywhere. He's in absolute unity. Since God is absolutely one, he can't be separated from his creative power. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov discusses this paradox at length, and he states that if God's essence were there in this vacated space, there would be nothing else besides him, besides this infinite essence. And if this were true, then there would be no place for anything else to exist, any otherness. So the truth is that God's essence must nevertheless still be here. We know for certain that nothing can exist without his life force. Therefore, if God's essence did not exist in this vacated space, nothing else would exist there either. So we have this paradox, as stated very clearly. If nothing can exist apart from God, yet in God's presence, nothing else can exist. So the resolution of this paradox, there is one, comes in from a book called the Zohar. So the Zohar refers to this concept of this vacated space, this Tzimtzum, as the lamp of darkness. And This lamp of darkness is an idea where the vacated space is perceived as darkness only in respect to creation and to mankind. But in relation to God, it's perceived as light. And this is going back to this idea that God doesn't change. So there's nothing that God's action is going to do to change his essence in any way. So it is with this constriction of God's essence, or the blinding of creation to a creator, that this perception of otherness becomes possible. This doesn't happen instantaneously, but rather it does occur through a process of gradual descent and transition between absolute divine unity and our corporeal physical world. This process is known as, as his tashlut. So this is a process that gives rise to our perception of having a self-sufficient and independent existence. And this concept is going to, God willing, be explored in depth in the next class. So we're going to focus on this one really important thing, which is our creation. So let me see, pause here, or there's some questions. I may have missed them. Do we have any at this point? Did Donna have one? Okay. I don't see any per se. So, I'm sorry, I'm missing. The divine light already existed, but God cannot withstand this light for anyone. Okay. My apology. So we have this idea that we have a sense of self, a self-sufficiency. We view our existence as independent, not independent of just God, but independent of each other. I'm not you, you're not me. And therefore we have this capacity to see ourselves as completely independent functioning creatures. So how do we seem to be individuals free, yet there is only God? So we're going to get into that a little bit more. So one of the things you would say is you have this sense of self, you have the sense of yesh, you have your sense of being and otherness, yet is this true? And one of the things I really want to say here is, don't be mistaken and think that God gives rise to a separate existence, but rather it is God is existence. So our sense of self, our sense of identity, our sense of separateness, while in fact real to us, is, as stated, a condition of us being blind to the reality of the world in which we live. As stated earlier, if God were to withdraw himself completely, any creation would cease to exist. So there has to be a connectivity to God. Even in spite of this contraction and our sense of being completely separate identities, this is only an illusion based upon our limited perception and reality. As stated earlier, if God withdraws himself, we cease to exist. Therefore, creation has to be constantly sustained and brought into existence at each moment, including us, including our reality, including our physicality, our existence. It's only our ability to perceive God's presence that is limited, as God becomes further and further concealed behind the garments of these spiritual worlds, various concepts, and ultimately by the physicality of the world ourselves. So this tashlut is this concept that you have this infinite being that comes down into these traits, characteristics, attributes, and ultimately the creation of individuality and our sense of self. And this is important. And we're going to come into why it is so important in the future in just a bit. So, and this idea of this garments and how the world comes down into being, that's God willing, like I said, want to get into further. We're getting into the sense of self, the sense of identity, and this sense of separation that this contraction gives to us. And that's a really important question Taz brings up. And it's one that feels, that's asked by many. If this is true, are we actually individuals? Are we us? Are we really ourselves? Do we have a separate existence? What is the purpose and the function of this? And the idea is, yes, you are you created with a specific intent. And we're going to get into why our existence speaks to the very purpose of creation itself. So I'm going to leave you hanging on that one. So you come back after the break. I'm going to play a little bit of music while I get a drink, and hopefully everyone comes back. It'll be just a short one. And hopefully some good music. And we'll be back in about 3 minutes or so, or less. So thank you. Okay, I appreciate that little break and lots of good questions. And I'm really glad I picked an easy topic. So I'll have some hopefully good answers, God willing. Okay. So a couple of the things that people have talked about is God following the rules of logic. And one of the a topic that's discussed at length in various sources is this idea is, does God have to be beholden to his own rules? And obviously no. God at any time can suspend the rules, not only of the physical universe that he set in place, but of the spiritual orders of the world as well. And we see this happen very often. And the major construct that we see this operate through is through the idea of rachamim, or his mercy, where judgment can be trumped by God's attribute of chesed, his loving kindness. And we see this happen numerous times throughout the Torah. So this picture here is a phrase, a very important phrase, meaning ein od milvado, there's no other power apart from God. And ultimately, this is a really important question. If this is true, if there is no other power apart from God, then does our existence have meaning? Does our sense of self really exist? Do the consequences of our good actions, our bad actions, do they really mean anything in the end? Do we mean anything? And the answer is quite loud and resounding yes. Our existence is a reality because God has created us and the existence that we are the purpose of creation. I'm going to get into how we get to that point. So creation has an intent and a purpose, as the Arizal states, when it came into his simple will to create the universe. So obviously, God's will, his ratzon, is to create the world in which we exist. So, but the question is, what is the purpose of creation at all? Why are we here? For people who are not familiar, there's a rabbi's named Rabbi Chaim Moshe Luzzatto, the Ramchal. He answers in a book called Derek Hashem, The Way of God. He gives an answer to some of life's really deep questions, like why are we here? What is the essence and nature of creation? What are the essence and nature of God? What is prayer, prophecy, all of the Torah, Revelation, commandments, mitzvot, all of these things. He talks about these at length. In the very beginning of the book, he expresses the really important idea of why are we even here? And he answers the question in two parts. He says, what's the purpose of creation? And he answers the question, well, we know that God had a desire, a will to create. So we have to first ask, what is God's will? And what is God's desire in creation? And the answer to this is to bestow good upon another. As the Ramchal states, since God's desire is to bestow good, sorry if there's a typo, a partial good would not be sufficient. The good that he bestows would have to be the ultimate good that his handiwork could accept. God alone, however, is the only true good. And we talked about this idea last time, that the concept of goodness as it pertains to God is infinite. God alone, however, is the only true good, and therefore his beneficent desire would not be satisfied unless it could bestow that very good, namely the true and perfect good that exists in his intrinsic essence. So the short of it is, God desires to give us himself. So the ultimate good is to know God exists, to have a relationship to God, and to be able to connect back to God. But for this to be true, the question is, what is this object of desire? So we have a will, a desire. What's the object of desire? And who is this good to be bestowed upon? The object of God's desire would have to be very unique within creation. They have to be capable of attaching themselves to God, who's an infinite being, as we discussed, and interfacing with the infinite. And the Ramchal has an answer. He says, his wisdom therefore decreed that the nature of this true benefaction would be his giving created things the opportunity to attach themselves to him in the greatest degree possible for them. The purpose of all that is created was therefore to bring into existence a creature who would derive pleasure from God's own good in a way that would be possible for it. God's wisdom, however, decreed for that such a good to be perfect, the one enjoying it must be its master. He must be the one who has earned it for himself and not given it on accident or by chance. One sees that this arrangement is partially reminiscent of the perfection of God himself, at least to the degree that is possible. For God's perfection is not a matter of chance either. So I'll explain this a bit more because I love the Ramchal, but he's very wordy. So obviously the creature, we're gonna skip on to the next one. Obviously this creature is man. Mankind is the only created being that has a sense of yesh, or a sense of otherness. We're endowed with our own desires and a sense of self. So the idea is that we are made in the image of God, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image or likeness of God. And we know that one thing that transcends even Tzimtzum, even the contracted space that brings about physicality, is this the sense of will, desire to create otherness, desire to create good, desire to bestow that good upon another. And so we exemplify this very powerful force, the very force that brought creation into existence, this sense of desire or will. As we're made in the image of God, this idea of will or sense of self is exemplified within us. It's reflected in us. So we have the capacity to do something that no one else in creation has, and that is choose good and reveal God's goodness and his presence within creation. We can choose to do bad and further conceal God's presence in the world. No other created entity has this ability. So we can see that there, with this immense power that this the immense power that this capability has, it's really exemplified in the account of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They choose to exercise their sense of self, their will, against God's command, and therefore they cause immense damage to themselves and to creation. So going back, when God willed to create the universe and ultimately mankind, it was therefore necessary to create an opposite of him. And you can see this in a smaller example of Adam having an opposite being created, which was Eve for him. So this is the very essence of the contraction or the symptom itself, this opposite force. While this constriction allows for finite beings to exist, ultimately endows us with the sense of yesh, a sense of self, and a sense of our own will and our independent existence, it also creates a force that's capable of concealing God's infinite light, which is very true of what happened with Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve were endowed with this sense of self, and they were given a task. This was a tool, a mechanism that was to be used to complete the work that they're here to do, which was to the few commands, to not eat of this tree, to tend to the garden. And afterward, when they completed their task, they were to enjoy the world to come. And so Adam and Eve's truest desire really should have been return to the source, that experience, that oneness and connectivity back to God. But when they assert their own will against God, their choice really embodies the antithesis of why they're even created in the first place, the reason for their being. And in essence, it becomes a denial of the ultimate reality that was vested exclusively to God, that he fills the heavens and the earth, that there's no other place that's void of his presence. There's no one else besides God. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov teaches, if you can believe you can destroy, if you believe that you can destroy, I think we have here, I'll read it again. If you believe that you can destroy, believe that you can repair. That is, if mankind has a capacity to damage creation, he also has the capacity to repair creation as well. So this goes back to, are we real? Yes, Adam and Eve definitely were. They had the capacity to damage creation. They're held accountable for their actions, and they have the capacity and they're given the opportunity to do the repair. So their existence is real. Our existence is real. God, we are an extension of God's higher yesh. Ultimately, we extend from the light, the Or Ein Sof itself. So we're going to Adam. Adam sins and he fails to rectify creation. And that kind of falls on to another. So Abraham joins the scene, and he has he does the opposite of what Adam and Eve do. He recognizes in the midst of complete darkness, the true God, the one and true God. And he, by his actions, repaired the damage that was done before him. He teaches the world of God's greatness, his exaltedness, his majesty, and his attributes, how he lives his life. He exemplifies service and humility, the opposite of extending your own sense of yesh, your own sense of self, your sense of I, your ego. He is known to be the opposite of that. He's humble, and he serves not only God, but he also serves everyone that comes across his way. He is known for his hospitality, that he doesn't consider himself so great as to not humble himself and serve anyone that comes through his tent. So his only desire is to serve God, and he does so without any reservation, even to the extent of sacrificing his own son, Yitzhak. So he exemplifies the opposite of Adam and Eve do. He exemplifies this idea of bitul, this concept of bitul hayesh, nullification of our own sense of self, nullification of our ego. So just as Abraham is commanded to go to you, which lech lecha, it's a whole Torah portion, go to you, go to yourself. This is a description of beginning of Abraham's journey, and the Arizal says it's not just the journey of Abraham, but the entire scheme of creation in general, and that of every individual soul. And he says that we have to undergo our own simsum, our own contraction, this own taking in of our sense of self, of our yish, to make room for God's presence. And so a vessel that's Rebbe Nachman says a vessel that's full of something has no room for anything else. Like a cup that's full of liquid can't take any more liquid in. So we have to contract ourselves, contract our sense of self. And as the Arizal says, just as light is preceded by darkness, and this is from the account in creation, and it was evening and it was morning, day one. Therefore, to create a yesh, ourselves, beings, the people who are endowed with a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of independence, and must experience the same thing, that we have to experience our own darkness, and this will be followed by morning or enlightenment or light, that we will become full, we make room for God. And that is the idea of the yesh, experiencing bitul or nullification. And this becomes day one, a new beginning, a new level of understanding, a new level of connectivity. And so I know I didn't get into a lot of the concepts and these deep ideas, but this sense of self, the sense of the viewing ourselves as independent beings is really important for the rest of creation, and how we relate to God. And that we are given this very powerful force, this very powerful tool, and we're to utilize it to return back to God. And that's, God willing, what the next class will be. This idea of, we talk about this interface. How does the finite interface with the infinite? How does the physical affect the spiritual? And it is the building of this interface that God undergoes his own sense of contraction, his own bitul, that he goes from infinite down to the very level of physicality, buried himself within creation to have a relationship. So going back to, are we real? What is our purpose? We all have a purpose. We are this sense of self, this sense of identity, this sense of yesh is not given by chance. The Ramchal says this very clearly. He says it's not given by chance. It can't be given by accident. So every aspect of creation exists because God continually brings it into existence, sustains every bit of it, every aspect of who you are, where you're born, your DNA, your family, the times you live in, what you do and don't have is orchestrated by God for a specific intent and purpose. You and you alone can fulfill that role. No one else in creation can. And so therefore, your existence is desired by God. God desires you, not just sorry, I got lost. So God, you are made with an intent and a purpose that only you can fulfill. And therefore, that gets us to the next step. What is our purpose? What is our function? What is our role? How do we know what our mission is? And how do we make our way back to God? How do we overcome the sense of self, which has been given to us as a mechanism to get back to God? But we can see very clearly, time and time again, also becomes the stumbling block that can keep us from connecting to God. And that is the effects of the sin of Adam and Eve, that now this external force of our Yetzer Hara, our inclination towards our own selfishness, our own ego, now becomes an integrated aspect of our very being. And we have to work to separate the good from the bad. And that's what you get into the idea of Pesach. You get the chametz, you get the leaven that can cause rooting out the chametz in your life, getting back to the tov, back to the good, back to the connectivity. So I know I've said a lot and I haven't answered a lot of questions specifically. So if anybody wanted to go on the mic or to ask questions in text that I may have missed, please feel free to do that again. Yeah, I'm leaving time here at the end for question and answer. Like I said, I picked some. I've kept it very general, very vague, and I have I've done that in purposely because so the next class, God willing, I would like to do is talk about that initial interface. The initial interface is this. We talk about the garments of concealment that God uses in this concept of Hishtashlis. So God, like a human being, we clothe ourselves. The next slide. Oh yeah, here's our next slide. Thank you. It keeps freezing. So we, before I end, I am going to, I do have a lot of links. I'm going to post them. And there are some amazing classes coming up. I have, let's see, the next class on March 13th is Kabbalah in the Matrix. You could have done a lot of Matrix references in this class, chose not to, keeping it for the Matrix or Rebbe. Next is March 20th, Divakut, Jewish meditation. You cannot miss that class. This is practical applications and how we build that ladder back to God. And for the women, Nishot Bina, women of understanding, and that is on March 27th. So it's 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time for these rooms. Love to see you there. So God willing, the next class, we're going to talk about the mechanism to the interface. So you utilize this sense of self, the sense of identity and separation to build back a bridge to God. And in the garments of creation, one of the most easy things to understand for me is the concept of a king. So the first interface that we meet is the idea of Malchut, or sovereignty. And the inner aspects of sovereignty are a crown, a king, a people to rule, a kingdom. And therefore, this is one of the deepest yet easiest to grasp of this idea of a garment that defines, a garment that conceals can actually reveal. And that's what the next class is this. God further concealing himself to the point of almost not being seen, like the king who is adorned in all of his robes and the crown and the scepter and all of these things, actually reveals more of his essence than, the average person wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt. When you look at the king that he's the king. And so I think this is being recorded and we'll be posting it in the room. Again, it's been a tremendous blessing to have everyone here and joining us. Any classes, any questions? Anybody want to jump on the mic? Sorry, let me mute myself so I don't cough in your ear. Okay, let's see here. Question, are you healthy? I am recovering from an illness. I still have some lingering effects. Cough is the big one. So healthier than I was 6 weeks ago. So thank you so much for coming. Tremendous blessing. Post your questions. I will have, over the last few weeks, I may have been pretty silent in our group. I was pretty swamped catching up after being sick, catching up with a lot of things, but God willing, I'll have a lot more time this week and I'll be posting some more information, videos, and please post your questions and comments. Okay, Shalom.
Yeah, I just want to thank you very much. It was great. Welcome you all next week. Finally getting around to doing the first Matrix group. Normally, the Matrix class would precede Elisheva's class, and we may flip it back that way. We'll have to review the contents to see if that still makes sense. But for now, it is next week on the 13th. Approximately the same time, we'll have to start promptly at 9 because I have to cut out around 10:30. So that's the outer bounds for that. And
yeah.
Diana said we're going to adjust the date for March 27th off of Pesach. We're not sure yet. We're going to announce that pretty soon. We're going to figure that out over the next few days.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Shavua Tov.
All right, good night, all. We're going to be closing down the room. Like I said, if you have any questions that come to mind, post them in the Ancient Wisdom for Modern Life group. Great place to just encourage discussion and add more resources and all, which we'll be doing for all the groups. So if you think of something after you go to bed tonight, just sign on and post it in there. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you soon. We're going to close the room. Thank you.